This week on The Rock.
Yeah.
What's going on The Rock?
Well, something is going on in your life. You just had a wonderful vacation.
Yes,
but you also,
I was on a different rock.
Yeah,
the Hawaiian rock.
Yeah,
the Big Island.
They have several of them.
Yeah. Yeah, it's wild how like similar island lives are. Everything is much slower in Hawaii, much like here, as are the drivers, much like here, as is the age demographic.
A very placid place to retire to. Slow down a little bit.
I would say so. How was this rock?
It was about how it usually is.
Yeah. Anything particular in the news that I missed?
Well, I saw some news from you actually. You just published a piece in the Globe and Mail, right?
Yeah, it was an interesting piece that I had learned. Living in Victoria and being a marijuana smoker, I frequent all of the stores, and the one that was my favorite was the Songhees Cannabis store. There's two of them, and they're both incredibly beautiful, and not only that, but they tend to highlight indigenous cannabis producers and like companies and whatnot.
Yeah, because there's different regulations around kind of farm to table and things, I believe, if it's coming from an indigenous producer, right?
The government has some things in place to make it a bit easier for indigenous cannabis producers to get into the business over like other, private, maybe, kind of settler companies.
Totally.
But that said, there's still a lot of red tape. Like, for example, BC itself can have as many stores as possible, but private cannabis retailers can only have 8. So say Songhees Cannabis, I think at the moment they only have 2. If they got incredibly, successful, they're still limited to 8.
They would be limited to how far they can franchise it
or
spread it out.
Yeah, and not only that, but their main competitor is the government. That's your number one competitor, and they can also limit you. It seems a bit unfair. So one thing, learning that I realized talking to a gentleman in Ontario on the Alderville First Nation. In 2017, he opened a cannabis store, and it's now called the Green Mile. It's in Alderville First Nation, just in Ontario. And he opened it technically on the black market, and what he calls it, and many indigenous cannabis experts are calling it, is the red market. As long as the First Ban Council approves it, it's technically legal, and it's kind of murky and gray. Like Health Canada acknowledged, like, yes, this is a thing, and they're allowed to do this, but we're trying to work with them to get more indigenous entrepreneurs into the legal market. So it's a fascinating story, that one that I learned, and don't take it from my voice, but take it from the people that I interviewed for the story, and just go to Globe and Mail and read that piece.
Yeah. It is an interesting piece. And while you were away, we did have a little bit of news on the Rock. As slow as life may be, things do still crop up from time to time. The CFL's BC Lions just announced yesterday that they will be playing a full game here in late August of next year.
Nice.
So this is now a kind of Pacific program, similar to the previous Atlantic program that they used to have, where they would go and have teams play in Halifax or in other maritime locations, because there aren't any teams out there. They've been trying to put a team out there, maybe in a stadium with the Halifax Wanderers, the soccer team, but nothing seems to be materializing there, so they are turning their gaze west and having the BC Lions play in more cities in BC, beginning at least with here in Victoria. And rather than use the stadium in the West Shore, where the West Shore Rebels, runner-up in Canada for junior football, where they play and where they've had a lot of success, this is actually coming to the higher capacity, I believe, Royal Athletic Park in central Victoria, in the municipality of Victoria itself. So there was some kind of back and forth throughout the course of the year of where in the region this CFL appearance would end up.
Well, it's interesting because the women's rugby team is so popular here, and there's like professional sports that are like getting a little bit bigger on the island.
There's Pacific FC. There's the UVic teams are always quite successful. We just had the women's rowing team win another national championship. So it really is quite I assume because the milder weather allows for more of a year-round outdoor training, there really has been a ton of sports success, particularly in the last decade here in Victoria.
Yeah. CFL though.
You're not moved? You're not moved? What, do you think
know.
the NFL's going to come here? Oh, we're going to come to Victoria, BC. Can you fit 100,000 people in Royal Athletic Park for us, please?
Well, I think that's why they chose the Royal Athletic Park, likely because, how many people are going to go see it.
I think it'll sell out.
I come from Edmonton, and our stadium for the CFL games in Edmonton is just so big that anytime you go, you're like, wow, this is not a good turnout.
It's the thing. Do you want a big, impressive stadium, but it makes the turnout less impressive?
Yeah, but that's why I think Victoria could actually sustain a CFL team.
Well, Victoria is, at least with these novelty kind of one-off events, like we've had basketball tournaments, we've had Raptors training camp.
Yeah.
I think the Canucks have come here a couple times and done kind of training camp and that kind of thing. And because it's, even for concerts, there is that barrier of, they got to get on the ferry, they got to come out here. We don't get quite as much. So whenever we do get one of these prime time professional sporting events, or even something adjacent to it, there's usually a really large turnout. And the region has grown, of course, in the last decade or two as well.
Yeah.
So it does seem to be hitting right that level where it can sustain not a full-time kind of top-tier pro team, but some of these kind of lower tier leagues, like the Canadian Premier League for soccer, that second level, and also
those poor athletes.
Well, what do you mean? They're pros. They're making a living.
Yeah, true. Yeah, I always found it funny actually whenever I was perusing, because the salaries of pro athletes are very transparent. It's a talking point.
Cap,
yeah, it's like a talking point that sportscasters will talk about, and it's always interesting to me that lower paid athletes, lower paid, are still incredibly well paid. Yeah. Incredibly well paid.
Yeah, but sometimes at the lower tiers though, you do get people kind of in the minor leagues struggling away, and they're just making a normal salary, but kind of like an unguaranteed $50K a year or something.
Yeah.
And because it is an industry that obviously you can only really participate in for a handful of years when you're fairly young.
That's true.
But anyway, it does seem that Victoria, the attention can now sustain at least brief appearances from kind of these pro teams, and people will apparently come out for that, especially in the last few years.
And it's kind of a bigger thing about, how can Victoria sustain bigger concerts, or it's a larger thing. Are we going to build a bigger stadium in Langford, which is the only place I could think that a bigger stadium could go to get acts like AC/DC or anything like that, or are we just forever on our time living on the Rock, having to go across the Georgia Strait and head to Vancouver? So
yeah, and I'm sure there will be a tipping point with population as well. At what point will the South Island population be large enough that it kind of meets this threshold for whatever tier of act, essentially?
Yeah, we'll still have all the municipalities with their different mayors.
The CRD will have to adjudicate.
Yeah.
Okay, can we get AC/DC now? Can we get